Can you hear me? Yeah. Cherry, Susan, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yes, good morning.
Okay.
Yeah. Morning.
So welcome back after this excellent lecture, which we had by Damien Tailing in the previous session. We are continuing the conference with the panel discussion, Democracy and Technology, bringing deliberation to the mass public. I have met Cherry several months ago, and it was one of those networking events which I had discussing about the deliberative experiment which we performed here in Serbia. And there was a person there, a colleague, who told me there is one person that is doing exactly a similar thing which you are doing, trying to boost deliberation into decision-making processes, and you should meet her. And then that is how I met Cherry, and that is how we got introduced all together. Cheda is trying to tell me something. No, it's okay. It's okay. And I'm really pleased that we managed to organize this panel session today. I'm really sorry that you are not able to join us live here, but still, I hope that there will be a point in future time, when we are all gathered here in Belgrade or somewhere in the UK or somewhere else. But still, thank you very much for joining us. So I'm going to present today our panelists. Cherry Davies is director of Nathan Center for Deliberative Research in UK. She has been working at the intersection of the evidence and practice in public participation for over 15 years, through roles in community development, social research, and non-for-profit boards. Her Center for Deliberative Research focuses on bringing social science rigor to deliberation and dialogue as ways to explore public attitudes, contribute to policy making, and influence research practice. She has background in academia and civil society, which I find particularly useful and interesting. And she previously led the University of Brighton's Community Knowledge Exchange for almost 10 years. Next, to Cherry, I am particularly pleased to greet Susan Hall, who is Director of Engagement at the Policy Institute and King's College London. She took this post last year, as far as I saw, and she came there from the Ipsos Mori research team, where she led the qualitative research team. She's a highly skilled qualitative researcher with 20 years of public policy research experience. And she was working at Ipsos from 2013 and being responsible for embedding new and innovative approaches to solving policy problems with a focus on deliberative, participatory, ethnographic, and digital methodologies. And Susan also has worked for both national and international clients across a range of policy areas, including trust in government, which is particularly interesting for this institute, I have to say, as we have one project which is focused. Then polarization, the value of evidence, work and welfare, aging and inequality, all, I would say, very relevant topic for contemporary societies. And I'm really sorry that I cannot greet today online with us Alice Sue, who is Senior Research Scholar and Associate Director at Deliberative Democracy Lab at the Stanford University. She was feeling sick this morning, so she's not joining us, but I hope we'll have a chance to see her also at some point. Also, I would like to introduce my colleague from the Institute, Irena Fiket, who is coordinating Lab for Active Citizenship, which is actually focusing in, I would say, previous 2 years on deliberative experiments, citizen assemblies, and different ways of participatory democratic innovation. She's joining me here in moderating and being also in the role of discussant. So I won't take any more time. I will let now Cherry and Susan to present, and then we are going to open discussion with Irena.
That's great. Yeah. Thanks so much, Gazella. Thank you for those kind introductions. And we're also sad that we can't be with you in person. And I'm also hopeful there will be some future opportunities for us to actually meet in person. And again, just to pass on Alice's apologies, it's a shame that she can't join us. We have some slides which we're going to show to help move through our presentation this morning. I am going to show them. I can see you in the room and I can see that our screen is frozen. So I'm looking at a frozen picture of myself. So I hope this is going to work, but if not, we'll just do the talking part.
We see and hear you.
Oh, perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to get this up. So the reason that we selected this as a topic to do a presentation and discuss with you today is that because between us, we're really interested in the question of how you can scale deliberation and make it available to the mass public, and the opportunity that technology offers us to do this. So there are two aspects to this which we'll cover in the time we've got. The first is to open up a little bit the question of which technologies and architecture can provide the means with which to engage large numbers of people in a deliberative rather than a more discursive format. So we'll try and talk a bit about that. But we also particularly want to bring a focus on the issue of time and consider whether how long people deliberate for can be condensed, and whether there's a relationship between using and making the most of online technologies and how long people have to deliberate for as a way in which to consider the question about how you might bring deliberation to the mass public. So we reflect on those two things through our presentation as to whether this can enable greater convenience, greater inclusivity, as well as scaling up and bringing in a greater diversity of participation to forms of deliberative democracy. And at the same time, whether that makes it more viable for a wider range of organisations to use these approaches and engage citizens in these ways. So obviously, deliberation is back again on many people's agenda for the role it might play in response to rising societal challenges, some of those that were covered actually in our introductions and work that Suzanne has done before. And especially now, we see a range of sort of polycrises where we have intersecting issues which are long-term and they are global in their scale, from climate change, issues to do with populism, as well as declining trust in democratic institutions. And much of what we understand, or much of our understanding of the place and value and the implementation of deliberation has developed from in-person examples. Excuse me. So whilst in the last decade or so, studies into deliberation and the internet have grown in quantity, this hasn't really translated into a consensus on what works. So how we can take the best of that, what learning we can gather in order to start answering or even asking the right questions about how to scale deliberation is still quite an open field. And as I said in my introduction, for us, considering technology in its broadest sense, and we'll say a little bit more about precisely which technology in a moment, really opens up the question of time for deliberation, when they happen, and for how long. And we think technology can reduce the relevance of issues that are often associated with face-to-face exercises, the barriers actually that those exercises often introduce around access for a range of people, geographical distances that they have to cover. And so these things, as we say, think slightly get in the way of face-to-face exercises. And the other thing that relates to both of those things around access and geographical distance is, of course, the cost. They tend to be really expensive, certainly in the work that Suzanne, Alice and I have all covered. Somebody always needs to put a lot of money forward to try to make these things possible. So it may be that technology can also offer us a route in there to examine that and see whether they can be made more accessible from a financing point of view as well. So whilst there's no overall review currently of sort of the effective modalities for online deliberation, what we do know from the existing scholarship is that the design of the communicative environment that a technology can host is really central to ensure that online settings can meet deliberative ideals. So obviously we know lots about where people engage with technology, social media, Twitter, for example, as a way in which to convene and discuss or swap opinions with each other. But there's some agreement now on some of the prerequisites that online environments need to have in order to achieve deliberative ideals. So for example, video software and moderators. help to counter some of the issues that can sometimes come about by being anonymous or faceless in online settings. Others argue that it's really important that individual settings or small groups of people in online settings are actively facilitated to alleviate opinion polarization. And some of the work that Alice, Suzanne and I have done between us on different projects have also provided further evidence of how deliberative ideals might be met in various online structures and architectures. Some work that we've done at NatCen started to show that deliberation does occur. So we've got some data that shows evidence of efficacy essentially in online video-based discussions on some large-scale work we did with about 400 participants on the question of post-Brexit policymaking. This was a couple of years ago. Some of the colleagues that Suzanne works with have shown evidence that online deliberations don't have to be restricted to mere exercises. They don't have to just be experiments or things that we just trial for research, but they can also be linked to societal decision-making in this context with respect to health and health ethics. And Alice's work at the Deliberative Democracy Centre in Stanford is also developing much developmental work. Excuse me, I'm just going to cough again. Sorry. Much developmental work that shows successful engagement and deliberation of participants at scale. This is involving thousands of people at any one time. So all of these things which are starting to emerge, which are of interest to us. Excuse me. I obviously haven't drunk enough tea this morning. All offer insights when we're thinking about what next and what advances we might need to make into some of the practical and technological facilitators of convening and delivering online deliberative methods, and what sorts of tools or resources we might need, as well as some of the ethical considerations that act on the experience of trying to implement some of these ambitions. So whilst from a technologies point of view, from a modalities point of view, we've got some clues about what's appropriate, what might work, there are also some emerging examples that give us some insight into where people are dealing with deliberation at scale. One of those is the recent Global Assembly on climate and the ecological crisis. And this, whilst it involved 100 people globally, which were randomly selected, there were numerous community assemblies in various countries across the globe, which also allowed a greater number of people to input into this deliberative process. Again, the recent Conference of Europe included over 650,000 participants over 1 year in a variety of event settings. So they weren't necessarily traditional formats for deliberation that we might recognise, but nonetheless, they were able to ensure a reach across such a wide number of people, as well as a number of in-person European and national citizens panels. And of course, we also have Stanford's online deliberation platform, which Alice would have told you a bit more about today, and we'll attempt to try to give you some clue to. And just an example here of this AI moderator technology has enabled, in one recent example last year, over 1,200 participants over 4 sessions in a national effort to discuss a series of national issues related to America. So not only do we have clues about some of the modalities that we need, but we also have some emerging examples about how to put some of this into practice in order to be interesting and effective. So as I said at the beginning, one of the things that we're really interested in this landscape is the issue of time. So obviously a range of authoritative sources, and for those of us who work in this field, we know that in general there's a sort of average duration that deliberatively democratic events occupy, and we have from best practice sources, for example, a citizens' assembly should last at least 30 hours. Across many examples which the OECD brought together recently, they identified that the average deliberation was 3.7, very specific, full meeting days spread out of the course of 6.6 weeks. So whilst this tells us something about how these spaces should optimally be run, what it also indicates is that it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of investment, not just from those who are trying to design the event, but also those who need to participate in it. And what we've also found in setting up for our own research, which is the thing which has driven much of this presentation, few studies really examine duration directly. So we have this kind of assumed understanding about how much time people need in order to deliberate. And the implication is always that longer is better. But obviously we know that the time commitment required in these types of formats can really be a barrier to some people to engage, and it definitely favours or biases participants who've got the requisite time, resources and material conditions in order to come out of their daily lives and participate in a setting like that. I've already made the point as well that extended periods of deliberation are often very expensive for commissioners and funders, which may indeed be a barrier to their uptake. So we're interested in whether you might still be able to achieve forms of deliberation in a shortened time period. And recent work by Alice and colleagues has indicated that opinion change, which we might use as a narrow proxy for evidence that deliberation has occurred, and it is just one and quite narrow proxy, is possible in some experiments they ran within a 6-hour time frame. So this, I think, shows some promise about the extent to which more compact methods can still support what we might understand to be effective deliberation and might open up some new opportunities in combination with new technologies. So this has led to a project that we're working on now. It's called Time is on My Side, which I think Suzanne assures me is like is it a Rolling Stones song title? So, you know, why not? It's always good to kind of jazz up your research titles where you can. And our project really is about investigating this hypothesis that if the time required for participants' views to shift in online deliberation is less than assumed in current methods, then we think that this indicates that deliberative efforts could be shorter, which is going to bring benefits for convenience and inclusivity, and scaled, bringing in a greater diversity of participation, including from those who are seldom heard, as well as making it more viable perhaps for a wider range of organisations to develop. So we're trialling what we're calling compact dialogue in 4 online events, which will happen in March and April next year. Each event will involve 50 people who will be randomly selected from a survey panel. And they'll take part in, each event will vary the time participants to spend discussing the topic. And then we're going to examine the extent to which opinion change occurs. And we're going to use that to try and tell us something. So Suzanne is going to talk a little bit more in a moment about what this might look like from a participant's perspective. I've said some things from a sort of design perspective or a research inquiry perspective. And before she does that, I'm just going to briefly cover the 2 slides that Alice had here. So this will by no means be an effective replica. But one of the things that's really important about our project is that we want to use the Stanford Online Deliberation Platform, which is an AI-assisted platform, which, as you can see here, has been developed led at Stanford and developed by Ashish Goel and also in collaboration with Alice's team. And the platform is based on the deliberative polling methodology, so a very specific format for deliberation. But what comes with that is 30 years experience of using this methodology across this range of countries and in some EU-wide projects. So there's a lot of learning there about how these projects run and what makes for effective design, which is all inputted into the platform. It's based on AI and machine learning technology, and it maintains flexibility for human oversight and intervention. So it's not something which is kind of locked or inaccessible to researchers. And indeed, in our own experiments next year, the plan is that each of us attends a session as an observer. So we're there in order to be present, just to learn for ourselves, but also be available to participants where necessary. The platform has been running now and delivered a series of experiments over the last couple of years. And as you can see here from the slides, they've had really excellent results. So it's a very interesting thing for us to think about using. And certainly I've been very keen to find a way to be on a project where we can use it for some time. It's had really high participant evaluations, so a good experience for people who are using it. It's been able to show really significant opinion changes via the deliberations that happen. It can enable equity of participation for those who are involved. And there is some evidence I'll talk to you about in just a moment where there's evidence that people are becoming more empathetic or are able to build empathy, even though it's in a AI moderated space. There's a series of features to the platform. Actually, it has its own website, so that would be worth having a look at, which essentially tries to replicate some of the dimensions of a deliberatively communicative space. There's a speaking queue, there's a timed agenda, there's a tracker of offensive language so that that can be picked up and there can be interventions. And there's nudging to try to join discussions and consider arguments from people who are perhaps less forthcoming in these spaces. So as Alice would also tell you, there are a series of outcomes on the platform which are of interest in the context of deliberation. Obviously, we've mentioned the fact that many of their experiments have now been able to demonstrate significant opinion change. They've seen that participants are really willing to listen to others and listen to the sort of other side of the argument, even though it's being moderated in this technological way. They've been able to evidence decreases in political and affective polarization through people's participation in the platform. And they've published an article, and they've got some forthcoming papers which also help to demonstrate that evidence. And what they also see is a desire for more engagement and sustained participation. So interestingly, we've seen this in our own online work. It's interesting to see how it comes even if there's not a human moderator in the room, where people have got a request to stay in contact with each other or with groups, and they want to exchange information, so they might stay in touch post the deliberation itself. So I'm going to hand over to Susanna, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the participant perspective on all of this, and then we'll share some conclusions.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry, and thank you to all of you. It's really wonderful to be here today speaking to you, and I'm sorry that we can't be there in person. So as Kerry said, I'm going to just talk a little bit through the participant perspective, because when we developed our hypotheses for this project, it was really helpful for us to think about what the current experience is like for those participating in deliberative mini-publics. And we drew on our own evaluations of our own projects for this, but we also found John Boswell's article, Seeing Like a Citizen, How Being a Participant in a Citizens' Assembly Changed Everything I Thought I Knew About Deliberative Mini-Publics, incredibly helpful. So just by way of a little bit of a background, Boswell is an academic, and he's spent much of the last decade writing about democratic innovations and deliberative democracy in particular. And in 2019, he was randomly selected to take part in his local authority's climate assembly on air quality, something he calculated as having a 0.002 chance of happening. In his own words, he'd hit the jackpot. And by his attendance, he became unique. He was someone who studies deliberation, but also has experience of it firsthand, not as an observer, not as a facilitator, not as an expert witness, but as a citizen. And in doing that, he was able to challenge much conventional received wisdom about how these processes are designed and delivered. And Kerry's already talked about some of the kind of received wisdom that we have on these things, particularly in terms of length of time. I really encourage you to read the paper if you can. It's really it's really engaging. It's very short, but I just want to hone in on a few of his reflections about participating that we think our work could help with. In the first instance, the paper notes just how much of an unusual and awkward situation a deliberative mini-public actually is, particularly when the facilitators take a step back and participants are left to their own devices. And in this, Boswell notes a difference between formal and informal inclusion. And what he terms as formal inclusion covers, so the facilitated breakout group discussions, the plenary sessions where expert testimony is provided. And he contends that here, the facilitators, as they absolutely should, work really hard to involve everyone in the conversation, make sure that all people have a chance to speak and be heard. But it's in the coffee breaks, it's in the lunch times when different rules apply. You don't have facilitators at those moments, and people revert to type. If you're shy, if you're younger, if you're less used to participating in public life, he said that those people tended to hang back and didn't mix with the others. And as he noted, the striking thing on the first day was the overwhelming sense of awkwardness. This was particularly acute during downtime in the breaks between sessions. The second issue it's probably worth highlighting is just how much information a participant is typically exposed to over the course of a deliberative mini-public. If you think about what we present them with, it's expert presentations, it's film testimony, we give them fact sheets. There's so much to take in. And that's because Boswell notes that we take an empty vessel to educating participants. We assume that they know nothing and that we need to fill them completely up with knowledge about the issue that's under discussion. But the problem is it can just be too much for people. And it can be hard for participants to differentiate between what they've learned. And as Boswell reflects on his experience in this climate assembly, there are only so many expert presentations you hear before they all start to blend in. And building on this, Boswell notes that, what's important here is less the amount that participants learn, or the content of what they learn, but rather that a shift takes place whereby they start to see themselves as experts on a level footing with the people that are presenting to them. And this can be achieved in other, many more efficient ways over and above the presentation of testimony. So Boswell recalls that what achieved this shift in the participants he worked with was not a particularly high quality presentation. I mean, quite the contrary. He said that the presenter that prompted this change was pretty light on facts, but what they did do was give an emotional call to participants to question what they'd been told. And it was this challenge that gave participants to license to think critically about the information and to challenge the presenters and each other, rather than being informed to a point where that they could do this. Third reflection I just want to draw your attention to is the experience of the recommendation, development and prioritization phase in any deliberative mini-public. Boswell notes how during this part of the process, his group, who he said had been really chatty, keen to participate, to that point, when they got to that bit, they then retreated into themselves. And that's because what we're asking them to do at that moment is incredibly difficult. The thinking behind it is very sound. So Graham Smith, in his 2009 book, Democratic Innovations, Designing Institutions for Citizen Participation, notes that in asking participants to develop recommendations, what we're doing is giving control over the agenda in the hands of the deliberating citizens rather than the organisers or commissioners. But in reality, people just aren't used to working like this. And what Boswell notes as happening is that participants struggled to make sense of the task that they were being asked to do, and the resultant policy recommendations were clear, they were unclear, they were unworkable, they lacked specificity. He said more often than not, they were just motherhood and apple pie. So the challenge here, though, for all of us is that a frequent criticism of deliberation is that we can't trace that link between what participants said and the resultant action taken by those in power. And more often than not, the blame for this is placed at the door of the elites. Maybe they're assumed to be more interested in, just engaging with people so they can say they've done that rather than actually making any real change. But what if the issue is that our design of these events, we're just making it more likely that they're judged to have failed on this important metrics, simply because participants tend not to be able to do that kind of work or have experience in it. So our hope is that this project will shine a light on the different ways that these common design issues can be tackled and that we can think about these things in a different way. So the first issue we're going to explore is whether a shorter amount of time spent deliberating is more inclusive. Now, the evidence on this from this point in the project seems clear. So Jacquet's 2010 paper explaining non-participation in deliberative mini-publics analyses the reasons for non-attendance at 3 different deliberations, which you may have read about, I'm sure, the G1000, the G100, and the Climate Citizens Parliament. And these were held in Brussels and Luxembourg. They involved different methods of recruitment. They ran for different lengths of time, from one day to multiple weekends. Now, he conducted 34 in-depth interviews with those who declined to attend and explored their reasons for not doing so. And the key among them was a lack of time. And in digging into this logic even further, Jacquet found that when participants said they lacked time, what they really meant was what they wanted to concentrate on the private sphere, i.e. they wanted, quite reasonably, to spend time with their family or those who were self-employed, in particular, on their work. Now, I've got 2 quotes that illustrate this well. When speaking about wanting to spend time with her family, one participant said, having 3 children, I've got other things to take care of. I try to focus on the necessary, and that is why I tend to leave aside so many things. My husband works as a freelancer. We barely see each other during the week. Therefore, during the weekend, I must admit that family time is a priority. And another participant who was self-employed said that it's a complete no-go for a boss to take a leave of absence for things that seem benign and unimportant. There is no choice. You go to work and that's it. So under this banner of lacking time, schedule conflict was also mentioned, by which we mean that people who may have otherwise been interested in attending simply had prior commitments, they weren't able to make it. But in our work, where we aim to shorten the time set aside for deliberation, it should be possible to make that deliberation more inclusive. People won't have to choose between participation or the private sphere. A shorter time frame will allow for both. And further, if we're able to run effective deliberations over a shorter timescale, we can also change when they're held. It doesn't have to be in the evening. It doesn't have to be at a weekend. They could be, for instance, over a lunch break. So something that Alice at Stanford has already trialed and had great results with. Our methodological experiment could also make the prospect of participating less intimidating and just less awkward for people. One participant in Jacquet's study noted, "This wasn't my cup of tea. No, really, all these associations and kind of things, it's not what I enjoy doing. I don't like group activities. Maybe I'm a bit like a bear hiding in his cave, but I don't like it. I don't like groups." And there are a lot of people like that. And this is firstly, and we hope that our work can help address this. And this is firstly because as our work is delivered online, there's simply not going to be the same awkwardness that Boswell noted around breaks and downtimes. Put simply, when there's a break in our sessions, participants will be able to have a break in the comfort of their own homes. They'll be able to step away from the screen. They won't need to make small talk with other people. And secondly, as it's shorter, there'll be less of a need for a break in the first place, perhaps none at all. Participants will just be able to spend that condensed time frame deliberating over the issue in hand. It's always important to note that there could be losses here as well as gains. Participants are going to have less of an opportunity to discuss informally with their fellow deliberators, to work together on shared challenges. But for people who feel uncomfortable attending public meetings or speaking out in front of others, then a shorter online deliberation could help. Jacquet noted two other reasons for non-participation, which we think our experiment could help us think differently about too. The first is inefficacy, in that participants do not believe that they have the level of political competence or expertise to discuss the issue in hand. And the second is around a perceived lack of impact that these exercises have, in that they do not lead to policy change. And these two reasons speak directly to the issue that Boswell noted around the problem with ground-up recommendations, in that participants tend not to have the skill or appetite to work in this way, and as a result, the recommendations lack specificity, they're unworkable, so the deliberation doesn't achieve the change that we want it to see. But in our sessions, which are designed to run over a much shorter time, there's simply not going to be the space required for participants to have open-ended, bottom-up conversations about the policy changes that they want to see enacted. We will have to have structure. We will need to present them with choices that they can debate and iterate. It's worth noting that Boswell includes evidence that imposing this kind of structure doesn't always come at a cost of limiting bottom-up innovation. He points to two ethnographic studies which highlight how these boundaries can help participants to think differently. So, for instance, he speaks of a health jury where participants were presented with two options, essentially which facility they needed to close. And when faced with this choice, they developed their own alternative solution, which broke the deadlock. And he also notes another example dealing with environmental policy in which the participants considered, but ultimately rejected the framing that they were presented with. And our hope in this work is that by applying more structure in shorter times, we will not hinder the development of innovative recommendations, but will facilitate them. We'll free from the pressure of having to think about new policies and ways of working. By reacting to options presented with them, participants will have more space to think about what could really work. Finally, our work has been designed largely with the participant experience in mind, but we also hope that there could be some positive consequences for commissioners and funders. And Kerry already alluded to this, but deliberative exercises are out of reach financially for many. And while there are innovations in commissioning taking place, So for instance, in the UK lately, a number of environment charities, such as the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the World Wildlife Fund, and the National Trust, have come together to commission Involve, the UK's leading public participation organisation, to run the People's Assembly for Nature. But organisations, by and large, still commission their own projects and to great expense. But shorter deliberations would allow for greater cost efficiency. And so not only could this approach be more inclusive for participants, but it could be more inclusive for commissioners as well. And complementing this, shorter deliberations could also decrease the length of time needed for analysis and reporting. The hypothesis here is that momentum would remain high, and it might be possible for commissioners to take those recommendations and put them in place in a more timely manner. And this, in turn, could not only lead to more real-world impact, but would also tackle perceptions among the wider public and potential participants that they do not make sense. And as we head into the field in the new year, we look forward to keeping you informed about what we find and the extent to which our experiments support our hypotheses.
So just some final concluding thoughts which summarise what we've just covered. For us, our starting point is that technology has the potential, and we're not alone in this, I know, to create more inclusion and offer greater reach of democratic processes and participation. And in this way, we think there's the potential to think about how different modalities of technology can contribute to more deliberative systems of change in society more generally. What we're also grappling with is perspectives, and this idea that what we might be doing, we've spoken to, we get a range of reactions to people when we talk to them about our experiment and the use of the AI platform in particular. One is a kind of rise of the machines type. People are a bit frightened or unsure or unclear about the role AI could potentially play in enabling a greater number of people, not least because we don't need to then staff a greater number of sessions with researchers. The contrast to that, of course, is that this might be an opportunity rather than a barrier around technology to trying to realise truer notions of the public sphere and an idea of a kind of a communicative sphere in which a greater number of people, or all of us actually, can be involved in. Another thing that we're thinking through is that, and again, this isn't our sole thinking, but we wonder if we might need to rethink what forms or systems of democracy technological innovations might support. So whether we need to think about and conceive of a more digital democracy rather than import, and what that might mean in its dimensions and its affects, rather than importing offline democracy to the online space. So that's a question which is new to us, but we think is relevant to keep thinking about. And finally, I just wanted to point to Helen Landamore's paper that she published this year on AI, actually, and the notions of mass participation. She says that we need to ensure that whatever efforts we're making with democracy and technology have to happen alongside an increase in general in society to engage in participation and deliberation. So even if we build it, it doesn't mean that people will come. And the other thing that she queries, which I think is also of interest to us, is whether AI is essentially the means to enable mass participation, or whether in fact it can be or needs to be a co-facilitator to these efforts. So are there different roles that technologies can play? For example, taking on the labour of doing the notes, gathering the feedback, analysing large volumes of data in very short amounts of time in order to contribute to efforts overall. So it doesn't have to mean that AI in our situation becomes the central facilitator of mass participation, but indeed there could be other roles that it and similar modalities could play in terms of achieving some of our aims. So we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much both for presenting, and thank you, Carrie. Chad was pointing to me that I missed the pronunciation of your name, so I'm sorry. You raised several very important issues, and I have to say that we, while dealing somehow with deliberative innovation, we were thinking exactly in terms of cost efficiency. I mean, costs of organizing deliberative poll, deliberative experiments, citizen assembly are really high if you want to do it properly. So this, what you presented in terms of shortening and maybe lowering the cost, is something which I think can be very valuable in spreading this kind of innovations around. Still, it's when I was listening to you, it still strikes me that this type of experimenting for the moment, let's say like that, is something which is really expertise driven. It takes a lot of expertise in order to organize it properly, especially if you want to tailor it in a way that it's shorter, it's more efficient, and it gets you to the results. So just a few reflections immediately after your presentation, but I will now give floor to Irena and then open the floor for the questions from the audience. We have approximately 20 minutes on our disposal. So Irena, floor is yours.
Thank you, Gazela. Thank you, Tara and Susan, for this presentation. Can you hear me all well? Because I saw my image frozen on the Zoom. I also very appreciate that you dedicate your research to the problem of scaling up deliberation and the costs and making it actually available to the wider public. And this particular aspects of the resources we need in order to implement deliberation. And naturally, I share the idea that technology could provide us this opportunity to reach the wider public. But I share some concerns with you, but I would like to open this more general question that you already mentioned in your presentation. This is the question of the quality of deliberation, or as you frame it, as meeting deliberative ideals versus speeding up the process and reaching more people. This dilemma could be also framed in different ways, and it's framed in the literature. You have on the one, you can frame it as, on the one hand, you have affects, opinion change, policy, already made policy proposals, changes of opinion, while on the other, you have this bigger picture of you can call some theoretical call it system, building deliberative system, or we can say building political culture of deliberation. And I'm wondering this, if you think about the main deliberative ideals that are, you said, inclusivity, and here there is a smaller but not that small question that you didn't mention, is that maybe a question of the population that is not familiar with using the online environments, that it's stronger in some countries than in the others. Then the question of cross-cutting exposure, discussion, listening, and replying to other people's arguments. So if you look at that as a quality of deliberation, I'm wondering if we can really reach it by speeding up the process. You also said in the certain point of your presentation, the studies showed actually that regarding the time, the longer is better. We also know that the studies previous to deliberation and the deliberation using in elaborating hypothesis that this is the intergroup contact polarization of the group, that actually familiarization that is very relevant, especially in this time of polarization of the public. It occurs during the time that we need a certain amount of time. I'm really bothered with this idea that we can speed up the process if we want to reach the familiarization with the others, meaning here different cultures of talking, argumenting, and then the output of deliberation made it that way can strongly actually depends on the time we spend in deliberation and cross-cutting exposure. I'm also aware that this is not a zero-sum relationship, but I would like to discuss more on this. Do you think that maybe we can establish a minimum standards also for deliberation online in order to reach a certain amount of quality in order for deliberation to be defined as such? Because you also mentioned in your presentation, you send us Hawthorne effects, and is this really deliberation if we shorten and we have not enough level of quality of deliberation? So beside these more general dilemmas, I would like to discuss about and discuss with you and open this question about if you're focusing on opinion change as a proxy for deliberation, as you said, is this really enough? Can we really use this as a proxy? Because studies shows that maybe opinion change can occur after the deliberation, and then in time they can disappear. So the time here also is a relevant factor. Maybe deliberation. Recently, I had possibility to talk with the professors from UK, and she still didn't publish this book about transnational justice, and she showed actually that deliberation in the with these highly polarized issues. The book will be published soon, actually cannot be measured by opinion change, because when she saw the discussions and elaborate the opinion change in the end, analyze it, nothing happens in this discussion between different ethnic groups. But the quality of discussion, measuring the quality and insight of the discussion groups during the time, after 1 year of meetings, actually something changed. So this is very relevant insights. So I would like to discuss a bit about opinion change as a proxy for deliberation. And my third question, I don't know, regard resources needed to implement deliberation in an ideal way. We also, as Gazela said, we also very often discuss about this if deliberative mini-publics are very expensive, and all of us that participated in organization, implementation, analysis of deliberative mini-publics, we realized that deliberation is expensive. But then I was asking myself this question, like, compared to what? How much money do we spend actually on elections and representatives and representative institutions? Not to say that we don't need representative democracy. I don't agree with that idea at all. I think deliberative mini-publics are something that should improve representative democracy. But still question remains that compared to what these deliberative mini-publics are expensive. And one more short dilemma I have, and I will finish this. You gave us the example of emerging, you said emerging examples that give us some insight on deliberation supranational scale. And these are those global citizens assemblies on climate change, Conference of Europe, etc. I recently studied and analyzed those, and what is a problem with the global scale is that they're usually not producing the political effects. So if we go back on time as a variable or back on effects of deliberation, like opinion change or policy effects, you're also insisting on that, then those examples, how we can analyze those examples. They are really not integrated into the political system. So they are not producing outputs. So how they can be used as good examples of deliberation. And I will stop here. I'm sorry that I took so much time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Irena. If you agree, I would just open the floor for 2 or 3 questions from the audience, and then I will give you floor to give your final comments in the end. Is there anyone who would like to ask something?
Hi, my name is Thiago from the World Bank. My question is, in terms of bringing deliberation to scale, right? Or making mass deliberation, if that is the solution, what is the problem? Is it that we want more citizens participating of that assumedly empowering experience? Or is it that we have a hypothesis that more people participating that has more chances of impacting policy, right? Because petitions, for instance, 10 people sign a petition is one thing, 5 million sign a petition, another thing. So what is the underlying hypothesis there? The other thing is just going back to what Irena said is opinion change, right? And you're going to be measuring, if understood well, on your experiments, if you can have opinion change. But I mean, how much opinion change do you need, right? Because maybe if you do a longer deliberation, you're having more opinion change, but maybe because there's somebody who has lots of resistance in the room and everybody's getting tired and giving up and everybody's opinion is changing towards that person. So when do you know that that opinion change would be kind of like maximize public goods in terms of collective decision-making? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay. If there is one more question we can take, and then we should give back floor. So if there is no one else, please, Carrie and Susan, the floor is yours for all these interesting comments and questions.
There's a lot, and Kerry, if you want, I can respond to the first part of Drago's question if you want to maybe talk a little bit about opinion shifts, and also to reflect really helpfully, I think, on some of Irina's comments as well, which were really helpful and constructive challenges, and thank you for them. But firstly, to the question from the floor, thank you. And you sort of said, you know, if we want to bring deliberation to scale, what is the problem? And it's a really, really good challenge. I think where we're coming from, it is a bit of both, as answers to these things normally are. You know, it is about more citizens participating, but it's also about achieving policy change. And I think the reasons we're thinking like that is, first of all, you will know this, but it's been a rough few years in British politics in terms of trust and trust in politicians and trust in institutions, and there are issues with representative democracy as it stands at the minute. And while I sort of endorse Irina's comment that it's not about replacing representative democracy, it is about augmenting it, and it is about complementing it. And what we have at the minute is issues with politicians, people not believing in what politicians are saying and not trusting them, but also in that they don't have a say in the decisions that affect their everyday lives. So making sure that we can get people involved and thinking about how they can participate in their political life is important. But also the issues that we're dealing with, the policy challenges that we're facing at the minute are not solvable within electoral cycles. They're too long, they're too big. It's around AI, it's around the climate crisis. We cannot expect politicians to solve that within a short political term. We need new ways of doing these things, but we also need to think differently about what the policy responses are. And that's when involving more members of the public becomes helpful, making sure that we've got a diversity of perspectives in thinking about what the change we need to see are. And Kerry, I don't know if there's any things that you want to add on that.
Yes, yeah, and again, thank you all for the reflections and questions so far. I mean, Irina, you could have been on the grant giving panel, I feel, because they asked many of the questions that you set out there in terms of trying to understand more about our experiment. So we should talk to you. I think that on the question of opinion changes the proxy, I think perhaps it would have been more helpful for me to set out in my early remarks that the experiment that we're running is really quite small. So the funding that we went for allowed us to do something really quite narrow. And so we had to make a series of decisions about what we thought would be most interesting to look at. So that's where we really landed on opinion change, simply because of all of the potential measures around deliberation. It seemed one of the easiest, to be frank, that we might at least be able to track within the time and the resources we have available. The other reason we went for that is because we were aware that the funding was for an experiment, and so our process is not currently tied to any particular policy, and it's not tied to any particular political kind of outcome. So we felt it would be less appropriate to be trying to use some of those measures to examine what we thought was going on. So in some ways it's quite an artificial construction, but in some ways that's also what makes it quite interesting, because we're able to put a little bit of a container around it and say, okay, well, what could we learn if we look at this, and does this help us at all understand anything about what might be going on in these processes within the limitations of the project overall? So that's really, it's a very pragmatic explanation more than anything. I think the other potential driver of the selection around opinion change is because Alice would be able to tell you more about this. Much of their work centres on deliberative polling, where opinion change is really probably the priority proxy for what's going on in what they're doing. Whilst there are other elements to that, I think that is one of the key measures. And because we're using, as they do, deliberative polling requires you to have a representative sample of people so that you can make some statistical inferences around what's going on with pre and post opinion measures. So we are adopting some of that, and we're ensuring that even though the numbers are small, we're following that sort of process. So that's the other reason that we've gone that way. I also just wanted to reflect back briefly on some more of the comments you both raised around kind of cost and the need for particular types of expertise, as well as the fact that one of the things I think is complicated, one of the many things which is complicated about some of the thinking that we and others are doing, is that you're right, Irina, there are no current minimum standards for deliberation in online contexts that allow us to say something about quality. And one of the things we've bumped into in some of our previous work in trying to write up some findings around kind of efficacy and quality in online deliberations is that it doesn't particularly exist. There isn't a single measure, and we don't really know enough currently about what that needs to look like. And that's actually the subject of a current grant application. So if we win that, I'll be coming back to you to try to move that forward a little bit. So I think that complicates the picture, actually, in trying to disaggregate some of the effects that we're interested in, and to be able to really say something substantial and meaningful about this small experiment that we have. So I think that's really important context, which we are aware of, and don't yet have the way to kind of disaggregate too much. My other thought on minimum standards of quality and issues around time and implementation and sort of forms of ideal effect to reflect briefly on some of the different outcomes and some of the different purposes that deliberation can have. And I think that obviously the most obvious in the context of democratic innovation is around forms of deliberative democracy, which themselves are tied to policy effect. But we also know that there are ways in which deliberation might be generally quite a useful thing for there to be, say, more of in the population, especially when we're talking about issues to do with kind of polarization and in the study you were mentioning towards the end of your remarks. So there's a series of different things, I think, going on in terms of how we want to parcel up some of the different things that we're interested in that might relate to these larger questions around mass participation, and try to take sort of steps towards them, whilst knowing that we can't necessarily tackle the kind of whole picture as it stands. But I think the naming of these different dimensions is particularly important. Excuse me. So that we don't collapse together something which isn't homogenous and in fact needs attention and needs to be disaggregated in these ways, so that we can be really careful and particular about what we're looking at, and therefore what the claims are towards something which might be more happening more at scale. So just to reflect that back, and I think that's extremely important and necessary for us to have alongside the conversation around, oh, look at this potential, because the two things have to come hand in hand.
Yeah, and just to pick up as well on one of Irina's comments as well about cost, and you made the really good challenge, compared to what, and I think the point back is probably compared to bad deliberation done quickly, done by people who perhaps aren't steeped in the thinking and the design issues, or worst case, done by methods which don't then bring participants genuinely into the decision-making process. And the risk there is that we exacerbate all the things that people are already feeling about being excluded from political systems, not feeling like they're able or have the mechanisms to have a say. So I completely get that challenge compared to what, but I also think it is one that we need to think about in order of making it more accessible to commissioners, but more accessible to practitioners as well, something that's seen as a viable piece of work that people want to do, and is not the preserve of just a few organizations who can invest that time and money in running these things at the moment. I think a more diverse community practicing as well as commissioning will do us all good.
Could I just add a final thought as well, which speaks to diversity, and it's to come back to this idea around the risk, or the tension, let's call it a tension and a risk, that more shortened timeframes don't allow people to get to know each other. And when we're thinking about deliberation and its effects, obviously one of the theory would tell you that an impact on civic competencies, a reduction in polarization are things which are possible through deliberative means, and we might be ignoring that or potentially cutting off the opportunity for that by making things both online and making them shorter. So I'm curious as well to think about what we can learn and what kind of conversation we can have about where there might be more plural ways to follow different types of deliberation, but that one thing doesn't have to supersede another. So it's possible that forms of mass participation which are enabled through more technocratic means might need to sit alongside other things that happen that also have deliberative character in society, rather than be the only thing that's available to people. I think that's not necessarily how I would see it. I don't think that's a good idea in general, but it doesn't mean that I don't believe that finding more and more in different ways for this to be something that more people can take the opportunity for would be a good thing. So there's something for me about how these things relate to each other, and as well as that disaggregation in terms of how we're understanding it's important. I think understanding where these different things contribute to a more kind of participative mode of democracy or sort of democratic experiences is something which is possible for people. So I think that's just, an important framing issue for me around being able to, if we have better knowledge and a better understanding of different options almost, how can we pick and choose them in the context of a more kind of deliberative system which might enable sort of better outcomes for citizens and indeed for policy overall.
Can I just add something, Adela? Short, very short.
Very briefly.
Yeah, very brief. Like here, I would like to have more time. Like in deliberative mini publics, I think here we would also use more time to discuss. And this is, my final comments. But thank you for discussion.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for especially to Susan and Carrie, for guiding us through the very interesting examples and presentation and bringing some questions. I would just like to emphasize that, especially it was interesting when you, Susan, mentioned the practitioners, and when Carrie in the end said about how democratic experience is possible, and that is something which is obviously guiding us here in working more with deliberative democracy. We are working in this region. We are the only center which is dealing with this issue, and we are working in challenging democratic environment, let's say like that. So many of the issues which we have heard here are something which is, let's say, still far-fetching for this region, but what we are aiming to do and what is something which we are finding in the results of our experimentation, let's say like that, is that empowering the citizens through these processes is something which is really valuable for this kind of societies where polarization is very high, where there is increasing apathy of the citizens, withdrawing from the politics, and this is something which actually helps them to bring back this democratic experience, which is, in our opinion, still democracy is the best of all possible scenarios, is something which can maybe lead to helping practitioners which are dealing in the field with the topic of bringing back citizens into the politics and trying to make better decisions which will better satisfy citizen needs. So with this, I would like to end this, and I would just like to invite you all for the half-an-hour coffee break and remind you to check the agenda. We are splitting into two sessions after the break. This is the main hall, and the small hall which is announced in the agenda. This is the meeting room which we have on the first floor. So this is the main, and the small one, even it's a little bit bigger than this one, is in the first floor. Thank you very much for taking part into this session. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Lovely to see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to have you all, and let's get in touch after the holidays and discuss some other things.
That would be great. Take care, Gazella.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.